Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekend Wellness Hour show. Thank you for joining us today. And we are going to be talking with Kirsten Powell, a therapist here in Arizona with a wide variety of credentials, and I'm going to let her share in a second. But we're going to be talking about brain spotting, a type of technique that helps people go through trauma and become unstuck. And I became familiar with it earlier this year. Someone I know who has undergone this technique to help move her along. And so I wanted to bring Kirsten on today to share with us this amazing technique. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
This is wonderful. I'm always excited to learn new things about the brain. We all need help throughout our lives, sometimes every single day of our life. So anytime we can learn more about the brain, it's wonderful to have someone on here. So thank you.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So how did you get into this field? Kind of, if you could give us a little bit of your background, and I know you have multiple certifications.
Yeah, boy, talk about a long and winding road. And I always think that those are the best ways to come upon where you're at now, is because you get to wander and it shows up organically. So I have an undergraduate in social work and a master's in social work. And ironically, I always said, I am never going to go into private practice. I don't want to do that. I'm going to work on the big level. So I started out in the field of domestic violence and worked in that field for a very, very long time and saw just kind of the impacts of trauma in that field. And then I worked for a very long time with a community that is identified as what we call seriously mentally ill, which is unfortunately long-term mental health conditions that impair their ability to function independently. And so individuals will receive lots of community support. So I worked in that environment for a long time and kind of just wound my way through. I ended up getting rather sick at one point in time, and we couldn't figure out what was wrong. So that was really the integrated piece that came into my work, is that I went on and educated myself on integrated mental health. So that's understanding that the mind and the body are one. They are not separate entities, as we have believed so long, and that in order to heal and nurture one, we must heal and nurture the other, and that they are one contiguous circuit. So we have to eat well, sleep well. Our diet is not just what we eat, it's what we consume, both in the media, what we read, who we spend time with, how we spend our time, all of those things. And so that really became a big focus. I've always been passionate about women, children, adolescents, and that was a big need in that community. But I didn't have any formalized trauma interventions. I'm a narrative therapist by training, which means essentially tell me your story, as we all have them. And it's a really lovely theoretical framework, because it allows people to define who they are and understand who they are, free of bias, free of any sort of conscripted impressions of who somebody is or how someone should think. And so that's a really lovely way to serve people who are struggling. Many of the kind of founders of trauma work figured out rather quickly that you cannot just talk about what has happened to you and get closure and full healing on those things. So people like Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk and all of these really brilliant minds started to say, gosh, I think that we have to marry the somatic, which is the body, with what's happening in the mind. And we have to reconnect the two for people to move this through. And so once I started to study all of that, I thought, oh gosh, I really need to be incorporating this. And I have a tendency to not be somebody who really likes to follow recipes very well. And there are a lot of these amazing interventions out there, are absolutely brilliant. However, I'm a very much color outside the lines type person. And so they didn't feel like totally the right fit for me. And then I had a friend introduce me to brain spotting, and it just married perfectly with the narrative approach that I'm already rooted in, and allows for this fluidity in the healing process that allows me to honor the person's story. So I don't need to drive the bus. The
Okay.
person drives it. We call riding in the tail of the comet. So I really follow where they lead and just use some of my skill sets to prompt further healing.
Gotcha. And does brain spotting bring in a little bit of the body aspect of the healing from the trauma? Because you said that
Yes.
it's more than just the story. So does this
Yes.
help that kind of close that loop a little bit so you can clear?
Absolutely. So we know so much about the brain, yet we know so little.
Yeah.
So we are still learning all of the time. But what we know is that there are some very ancient primitive parts of the brain that encode memory and hold on to them. One of the challenges that we have is that we have the ability with our fabulous prefrontal cortex to just say, okay, I'm going to just like not deal with that right now and tuck it away somewhere. And unfortunately, that does not mean that it is gone and forgotten. It just means that it's tucked away somewhere.
Okay.
And the brain is association based, which can be why we smell something and then we are transported back in time to a memory, either pleasant or unpleasant. We hear songs, we see colors, certain times of year, all of those things. And that also happens with trauma. And while a large event can absolutely in its entirety be the reason that people continue to struggle, it can be these little tiny micro associations that happen as well. And so with the brain spotting, the big part of it is called focused mindfulness, which is
Okay.
really, where do you feel this in your body? Where is it showing up? What does it feel like? We use a SUDS rating scale, which is a subjective rating scale that just kind of lets us know how much activation you're experiencing. Some interventions will use words like distress, discomfort, and we try to stay in brain spotting. We try to stay as neutral as possible so that we are not maybe influencing or characterizing something for someone. And so the rating scale is usually 0 to 10, 10 being with the strongest sensation in the body. And then we just kind of travel from there and prompt to pay attention to the body as the mind is remembering or experiencing simultaneously. And so that's really our role, is to kind of remind the person, okay, check back in, check back in.
Got it. And so when you're working with someone and they're undergoing brain spotting, do you check with them first with the scale, 0 to 10 scale, the SUD scale, and say, okay, where are you right now? And then you go into brain spotting and then see how they are afterwards. Is that
Correct.
process? Okay. Okay.
And depending on the practitioner, it's very individualized in how people do this intervention, but they may even do it halfway through the session to see if it has come down. Really what we're hoping to do is deactivate the intensity of that memory. The memory is there. It's not going anywhere. The goal that we have, hopefully, is to make it less intense, and so that the body and the brain do not feel as if it's happening all over again every time they think of that experience or that interaction. And so the goal, sometimes it's lovely, people can get to that 0 and recall something with 0 problems at all or 0 activation in the body. And sometimes it ebbs and flows based on where they are in their life or what they're experiencing at the time.
That's crazy. So now with brain spotting, can we go over what exactly is happening? I know we had talked offline earlier and you had said that we have natural brain spotting. So maybe can we talk a little bit about what that is, and then brain spotting as a technique?
I think this was one of the coolest things. Dr. Grand is really the one who discovered, Dr. David Grand was really the one who kind of stumbled upon this natural phenomenon. He is world-renowned trainer in EMDR, and he had created some subsequent really kind of neat somatic-based EMDR practices within his for his clientele. And he had one young woman who just was really stuck, and there was an area that she just could not get past despite how long they worked together. And so he just one day took his fingers and moved them across her field of vision, which is very much what they do in EMDR. But he just so happened to catch something he called the eye wobble. And the eye wobble was really interesting because he had never seen that before in EMDR. And so he paid attention as that process through, and she was able to access different things that she had never accessed before. And that's when he realized, like, I think there is something onto this. And then he stumbled upon kind of this natural phenomenon that we have called gaze spotting. And gaze spotting is, and this has happened to all of us, it is a very surreal experience where you feel like your eyeballs are stuck on something. And you're like, I really want to move my eyes. This is so strange. And your brain is thinking, going through all these things. And you feel like you cannot move. And then all of a sudden it just releases. And then you move on about your business. That is a gaze spot. That is a gaze spot.
Okay.
And so it's just this really powerful way that the brain is trying to move information through the circuitry and file it in its appropriate filing cabinet. And we do this all the time, unbeknown to us. And then he started to kind of just build upon that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting with the gaze spotting. Sometimes it's almost comforting to just, it's like you can check out and you just let your eyes gaze. And you just kind of, it's almost as if your brain is separate from your body and you can just allow that to happen. I mean, it happens all the time, and I find it comforting, and just, I let myself go in it.
Yes.
So,
yeah. It's just kind of, and you're exactly right, because you're noticing this really interesting situation with your body where it almost seems like somebody pushed a pause button, but your brain is just doing its thing. So it's really, really neat. And so we can induce that in a brain spotting session, which is really fantastic. And again, every clinician has their own style. I work with children, who are infants, and then I work kind of with the entire age spectrum. So it looks different for everybody that I serve. But the first time you see it, it's kind of an interesting thing because there is a wand, and and it usually invites a lot of giggling and chuckling, which is kind of a lovely way to start an intervention that can be kind of freaky for some people, because there's an awareness of where I'm going, right? Like, I'm going to talk about this thing that's pretty heavy. So sometimes it brings some lovely levity to the situation. But yes, we use a wand because it can be really helpful for people, especially if what they're talking about is really heavy. The natural disposition sometimes is to move away from that rather than to lean into it. And so when you are helping to guide an individual into these particular spots that they are focusing upon, they can use this as almost like a guidepost to stick with. And so just kind of a point of rest for them, so they don't have to try so hard to stay there when they're experiencing other things. And there are so many nuances within it. So we can use outside window, which is where the individual says, well, I don't know where I feel it in my body, but the therapist can see reflexive responses, which are really important in the process. So reflexive response is something that happens at a very unconscious level of the brain. We have no idea. So it's like, I'm not telling my heart, okay, heartbeat, stomach digest, intestines do your thing, nerves work, blood pump, those are all very reflexive, natural things that are happening in our body all of the time. So what we have discovered is that there's kind of reflexive tells, and one of them can be blinking. It can be rapid bouncing all of a sudden of the knee and the leg. It can be shifting. It can be it can be gulping. So those really hard swallows are very reflexive in nature. So we as therapists, we're kind of trained to look for some of those to kind of start helping people when they feel really disconnected from their body, which can happen in trauma because the
Okay.
body is not safe. And so you just move away from it. And so that can be really helpful. And then there's another one, a technique that we use where the person has developed kind of that felt sense muscle, and they can say, oh yeah, it's right there in my shoulder. Oh, nope, it's in my hip. Oh boy, it feels like really tight right here.
Mhm.
So there are lots of different ways to get the person to a point where they're able to move those things through the nervous system. And that's really, really what it is. When we are experiencing these, we like to pathologize things in our field. We like to give everything a fancy name.
Yes.
But, these names of like anxiety and depression and PTSD, they are a culmination of neurological responses that happen when the individual has felt isolated, fearful, and unable to protect themselves. And so the nervous system just goes awry. And that is when we have that type of physiology. So it's not a moral deficit, it's not a character flaw, it's not because the individual isn't doing something correctly. It's that their nervous system has just come unhinged. And so doing things like somatic experiencing, like EMDR, like brain spotting, those are all ways to soothe the nervous system, which in turn allows individuals to move through their trauma and kind of integrate the stories into their book and not be driven by the fears or whatever is accompanying it.
Right. So when someone's going through a session, let's say I just show up, I'm going to go through a session and we're talking about some trauma in my life. How does that look? I explain some of my trauma first, so you have an idea of where we're going, and then you start with the wand and have me look at it, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. Typically, we use bilateral music. So I don't know if you're familiar with that,
No.
but it's really lovely. It's akin to yoga music. So it can be nature sounds. It's usually very like soft and comforting. There are always, those outliers who are like, that is horrible. I don't want to listen to that at all. But generally speaking, it's very soothing to the body. So what's really critical about the bilateral music is that it is designed to shift between the right ear to the left ear, back to the right ear. And it's a very kind of subtle, after the while, the brain gets used to it and you almost don't notice it. But what it's doing is it is kind of pushing the buttons on the side of the brain to say, okay, move now, because we don't want it stuck anywhere. We want it to go where it's supposed to go. And trauma is stuff that's stuck in different parts of the brain. And so if we can use something like that to facilitate that natural experience, then that's a lovely way to do it. So we use that.
Okay.
And then we use the wand. And so, of course, there's always lots of laughter right at first, which is lovely. And then, depending on the person, it's so individualized, which is one of the reasons I love it, because some people, they have a lot of felt sense experience. They've done yoga, they've done different types of things where they can tap into that and they're comfortable with it. Some people are very nervous. And they don't know what to expect. And so in those types of situations, the therapist might use something called a rolling gaze spot, which is where they are slowly working a wand across the person's field of vision and pausing based on those reflexive cues and just holding that spot. And so for a lot of people, with what it feels like, and even in my own experience, because we have to practice on each other, it feels a lot like a water slide. So we love to think that things are very linear in our brain. But when you go on an adventure with brain spotting, what you usually find is you start off at one point in time, and then you're 8, and then you're 35, and then you're 4, and then you're 11. And what it really indicates is that the brain has encoded and stuck all of these things together. And there's probably a common denominator either a repeated occurrence, a repeated event, or a repeated emotion that was experienced at each of those times. And so the lovely thing is that it isn't just only one thing that you're addressing. You're kind of soothing the entire pathway associated, this like tether of all of these experiences, and kind of giving them the deference they deserve. So you're sitting there in pain, paying attention and honoring each of those
Okay.
stories. And that's how it works. And so you just kind of move it through. And obviously, right at the beginning, we check like, okay, where are you feeling it? What number do you give it in your body? Anything above a 6 is what we would consider relatively activated, which means that it's your engine is pretty well revved at that point. And so it just gives us an indication that experience carries a lot of impact to you, that it has a lot of influence over your body and your mind. So we just kind of work through that, and then we check in throughout the process, and we just allow it to flow. Afterwards, I do a breathing exercise by Dr. Andrew Weil. 478 is my most favorite thing ever. And so we do that to kind of ground. And then there can be a little processing. We kind of set it up on a lot of self-care and those types of things afterward. And then each person experiences it differently. So every time we go into a brain spot, it's like opening a different door or window. It's never the same spot, even if it's a similar circumstance that we are processing. It starts somewhere different every single time, which is always really fascinating.
So when someone comes in, let's for example, I had a car accident that was traumatic, and we go through the process. You find out about the car accident. Is that something that once we go through it, that for one brain spotting session, that I would be done with it, or do we have to pick it apart? And I imagine it's different for every person. But is that a possibility that you would pick it apart more with each session?
Yes. Now, there are some instances where I've worked with somebody and they've brought something up, and it's a pretty major experience. And so they will likely have a reduction around that activation and hopefully not feel as intense as they had the first time we started. However, sometimes it's a one-time deal. Children are typically the quickest processors. Children and adolescents are typically the quickest. The older we get, the more life we have, the more experiences that link on and kind of are intertwined. I find that those are the ones where it might take a couple sessions, and it really is very varied.
Okay. I was just curious about that. And then how long is a session in one sitting?
My sessions last 50 to 60 minutes.
Okay.
So we usually kind of get going relatively quickly. What I find is that I have some folks who they're pros now. They don't need the wand. They don't need any of that. They come in, how you doing? Doing great. This is where we're going. And they're off and running. And then some people need the setup for a while. So it's very, very different. And how much time people need seems to vary as well.
Now, once they get into trauma, are they talking about the trauma? Are you asking questions?
Yes.
What's
And
going
this
on?
can be kind of a stylistic thing, which is one of the reasons that I love brain spotting. And I'm so grateful to Dr. Grand, because really he wants the clinician to be who they are as they're doing this, because that authenticity is absolutely imperative. And so as a narrative therapist, obviously, I'm relying a lot on the story. But it's also kind of a Nunya situation. So I have some people that when we process, and I am like that when I was being trained on this, it's like blah, 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 and I could not stop talking. I'd be like, gosh, I'm really talking a lot. I'm really talking a lot. And I could not stop. And then there are some people who naturally are relatively talkative, but they'll be very quiet. But they'll be doing things like, oh, and they'll be doing these little things throughout it, unbeknownst to them. So it's very obvious that they are engaged in something, that I don't even necessarily need to be a part of that, because really the brain has amazing capacity to heal itself. The body has amazing capacity to heal itself. It just needs to be given the environment and the kind of sometimes the directions with which to do so. And so that's another reason that I really love brain spotting, is because I am there just witnessing this person use their wisdom and their story to heal themselves. It's not about me as a practitioner. It's about this individual having the space to do so. And it's really beautiful and powerful.
That's amazing. And
Mhm.
so what are all the different cases and types of situations that people would seek this out as a form of
Ah,
treatment?
well, goodness. I think it depends on the demographic or the group that the clinician sees. I see lots of children, ages 0 up. So I see a lot of children and adolescents. So for them, it can be, trauma is a funny thing. It's not trauma with a capital T always. So there are some of these kind of universal traumas that we all go, oh, yeah, no, that is definitely so war, abuse, poverty,
Okay.
famine, chronic health issues, those types of things. I think unilaterally people would say, yeah, those are pretty rough things. And then there are the little t's, so kind of those subjective traumas that are very individualized and personalized. And they can be things like being rejected from your core group of friends in junior high. It
Okay.
could be um, n- being on the cheerleading team for 3 years and not getting picked for your senior year. The
Yeah.
pandemic has been a huge one. So there
Mhm.
has been lots of little T's as well that have come up, feeling like a sibling was the preferential child, those types of things. So, really kind of depends on the person. When they're younger, it's usually toileting, sleeping, fear of leaving their parent. Um, I see a lot of children when they start to have the existential crisis where they realize that everybody is mortal, including their mom, their dad, their grandparents, their pets. That's usually the catalyst for it, is a pet
Yeah.
passes.
Okay.
And so I incorporate a lot of grief work into the work that I do as well. So usually with the teeny ones, it's that. And then when we start getting into the higher grades, typically, kindergarten and up, it's a lot of school anxiety, parental divorce, a lot of children who have learning differences. So a lot of neurodiversity where they just have a hard time fitting in. I do a lot of work with feminist theory. So I work a lot with adolescent girls and trying to
Okay.
help them understand kind of the overt and covert stuff that happens for women and how that can impact them unwittingly. And then I work on up through it with death and dying, divorce, other women. So it really is just an entire range that people can
Yeah.
come in for.
Yeah. Anything kind of where they're stuck and have basically, yeah, had some trauma in their
Yeah, have a
life.
broken heart, have
Yeah.
some fear, have some pain that can't, I mean, and that's why, you know, while it can be these big cataclysmic things, these big
Mhm.
giant traumas with a
Yeah.
T, it's really anything that steals your quality of life, that has broken your heart, that
Yeah.
has caused you to lose yourself or not have the opportunity to even develop yourself because you lived in an environment where it was all about, moment to moment because there were things going on. So, it really is just what that person needs in that moment, whether I would think it was a big deal or not is of not any point at all.
Yeah. That makes sense. That's wonderful. I mean, you can reach so many people. And
Mhm,
when someone has a session, we talked a little bit that there is some self-care they do afterwards.
mhm,
What what happens after a session? Do
mhm.
they have mental homework or anything, or do they just sit and see what shows up? What
Yeah,
happens?
I think it's very different for everybody. I know that kind of seems to be
Yeah.
the generic answer for a lot of
Yeah.
things. And again, this is probably stylistic. Because I'm an integrated mental health clinician, the aftercare is a really big component of the work that
Mhm.
I do with folks. And so I kind of equate it to almost like a psychological detox when we do this type of an intervention, because people can feel a gazillion different things. And so I really try to normalize whatever they're experiencing. So some people will dream a lot, some people will feel emotional throughout the day. Um, some people might have an upset tummy, they might get a headache, those types of things. And so really I encourage them to eat nutrient dense foods, do things that bring them joy,
Okay.
and soothe their spirit, take naps, be with people who fill up their cup rather than deplete it. Um, Listen to beautiful things, read beautiful things, try to really kind of center and ground. And the intensity or what they experience right at the beginning usually kind of fades within, just per people's report, usually fades within a couple days. And
Okay.
then after that, the brain kind of shifts into what we think is a lower, deeper level of processing that's kind of offline. Like you don't really have an awareness of it.
Okay.
But I have had people tell me that it feels almost like those turkey things that you put in your turkey in the oven and it pops
Yeah.
out to let you know that it's all done
Mhm.
cooking.
Yeah.
They will say that it kind of feels like that, where like all of a sudden they were just like, oh, okay, I feel different. I feel a little bit better. I feel some relief, or I
Mhm.
feel like something shifted in some
Yeah.
capacity. And that's kind of how they describe it.
Oh, that's interesting. And then how often do they have a session? Do they wait a couple weeks to go through some processing before they do another one?
No, it really is up to the person. Sometimes if they've had a pretty intense one, they may want
Mhm.
to do kind of just an average Joe narrative type
Mhm.
session the next time I see them, and then brain spot the next time. So it really just kind of depends. Sometimes they are at that point in their life where their discomfort is so great that they just want relief from the
Right.
intensity of what's happening in their body all the time. And so they are just determined and they want to keep doing it every time they come in. When I do it with children and adolescents, it often involves coloring and art and music and things like that, playing those types of things. And those are things that we can do every
That's
single
wonderful.
time, and it
Okay.
and it feels comfortable for them.
That's wonderful. And if someone is not near you or considering the pandemic right now, is this something that can be done virtually?
Absolutely. I in a million years would not have ever thought to go
Yeah.
virtual, but the pandemic
Yeah.
has definitely taught us many, many things on
Yeah.
many, many levels. And so, yes, it took me a while to figure out how to do it virtually, but yes, there is a way. Some people, some clinicians still use the wand.
Mhm.
I am challenged because I cannot figure out which is left and right. It's all
Yeah.
superimposed. So I
Yeah.
had to come up with another system for myself.
Okay.
And I've had lovely experiences uh, using music, not using music, and then
Okay.
just guiding eye positions in the telehealth sessions. And I think a lot of other practitioners would probably echo that as well, that they
Mhm.
have been able to very successfully replicate this virtually and
Okay.
still have some really positive outcomes.
Good.
And the lovely thing about brain spotting is you can go to the website
Mhm.
www.brainspotting.com,
Okay.
and you can find practitioners all around the world. So it's not just
Oh,
in the contiguous United States. They have a spot where you can click on for Canada and South America and Asia and different parts of Europe, Australia. And so you can find people wherever you are located.
wow.
And if the person you reach out to for some reason is at capacity or is unable to accept new clients at that time, we have a really well developed network, and most of us um, have people that we can recommend or refer to
Okay.
if needed. So even if the person you initially reach out to is unable to take you on, they can make sure that they are connecting you with somebody who has the same type
Yes.
of training.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
And you also see people in person too in Arizona if they want something in person, correct?
Correct. Yes. So I have kind of a hybrid practice now where I see, a couple days a week in the office and a couple days a week virtually. And so that has been nice for people as well as myself. And it's
Yeah.
always very nice to see and to compare and contrast the differences between what it's like to meet with somebody in person versus virtually and things like that. And so there is that option. And I think a lot of my colleagues that I typically refer to are doing the same thing as well. They have the ability to meet with people either in person or virtually.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
This is great. Is there any last minute tip you would give to people or suggest for people, who are interested in brain spotting?
I wish you well on your road of healing. And the lovely thing about it is there is not one way to get there. And there are lots of people who try one thing and they feel disheartened because that's not a good fit for them. However, there are lots of ways to get where you need to go to have a life that feels comfortable and safe for you. And so, be that EMDR, be that brain spotting, anything like that, there are some amazing clinicians out there that can hold space for you, that you can leave your things with that you don't want to carry anymore, that can help you get to whatever your goals are using whatever techniques they have. And the brain spotting is just a really lovely one.
Yeah. Well, this is wonderful. And how can people reach you?
Well, I am tragically unhip and don't have a website. But you can find me at Kirsten Powell, and you can find me on Psychology Today.
Okay.
I do have an email address, and you are welcome to email me at any point in time. I'm not licensed outside the state of Arizona, but we can certainly see if we can locate somebody in the state that you're located if need be. You can also call me at my phone number, which is also listed on my Psychology Today page.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your Saturday with us. Thank you so much.
Oh my
It's
gosh,
always
this
such
was
an honor.
so fun. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Please reach out to Kirsten if you're interested in pursuing this type of form of treatment for trauma and just, mental health. So thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of your weekend.
You
Take care.
too. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.